Hello, my name is Mike Petro, Executive Vice President of the Committee for Economic Development of the Conference Board, or CED, and welcome to Policy Watch. Policy Watch is a webcast series designed to connect business leaders to public policy issues of the day. Now, today we will discuss redistricting practices and the importance of competitive elections, and really why this is important to the business community. Now, before we begin our program, let me tell you a little bit about CED and our history. CED is a center of the Conference Board and is comprised of some 180 CEOs of major companies throughout the country. CED was formed in 1942 when President Roosevelt was engaged in conversations on how to move the economy from a wartime to a peacetime economy. In fact, CED's first policy study actually became the blueprint for the Marshall Plan, and CED's first chairman, Paul Hoffman, became the first administrator of the Marshall Plan. So for over 7 decades, CED's business leaders have provided reasoned solutions from business in the nation's interest, and we have impacted issues such as education policy, trade policy, healthcare reform, money in politics, agriculture policy, and other pressing issues of the day. Now, today's Policy Watch is titled Fixing Broken Redistricting Practices, the Importance of Competitive Elections. And we will answer critical questions that include what is gerrymandering and how does it impact our democracy? How can we best draw equitable district lines that adequately represent voters? And how competitive are our elections today? And then finally, is there a role that business can play in this debate? Now, before we get started with the webcast, a few housekeeping items. First, there are many ways to participate in today's webcast. You can ask questions via the chat box, download the presentation via the file download pod in the bottom center of your screen. View the video or PowerPoint in full screen by clicking the 4 arrows at the top right-hand side of your screen. At the end of the webcast, complete the brief evaluation so that we can integrate your feedback to future programs. And then finally, share the program on demand with your colleagues, available 48 hours after the webcast on the TCB website. Now, second, you can earn CPE credits by participating in today's webcast and following the instructions on this slide to make sure that you get the credit. Live participation only, I might add. Now, today's guest speakers are Trevor Potter, founding president of the Campaign Legal Center, Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit. Trevor is a former commissioner and chairman of the Federal Election Commission. Trevor served as general counsel to Senator John McCain's 2000 and 2008 presidential bids. And he has also been an advisor to CED on many of our money in politics issues. In addition to Trevor, we welcome Paul Smith, Vice President of Litigation and Strategy at the Campaign Legal Center. Paul has more than 3 decades of experience in litigating a wide range of cases, and he's argued before the Supreme Court 21 times and secured numerous victories. Gentlemen, welcome to the webcast.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Great. Now, before we get to our guests, it's been our practice here to do some polling of our guests, and to set the context, I wanted to let you know that in October of 2017, the Supreme Court heard a case from Wisconsin on the constitutionality of partisan gerrymandering. The Supreme Court has repeatedly stated that extreme partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, but they've really never found a way to decide which ones cross the line or not. So in 2018, that could be the year that changes things. So my first poll question to the audience would be, do you think the Supreme Court should uphold or strike down congressional districts that have been drawn to give lopsided advantages to the party in power, uphold A, B, strike down, C, not sure. I'll give you a couple of seconds to answer that poll question. Okay. So I'm going to go to the next poll. I don't see the results here, but I'm just going to go to the next slide here. Should the redrawing of congressional districts be controlled by an independent, nonpartisan commission? Yes or no? Or not sure? And then the third poll question, would you say generally you favor or oppose the Supreme Court setting new clear rules for determining when partisan gerrymandering violates the Constitution? A, favor, B, oppose, C, not sure. It's okay if you're not sure. This is a new issue to some of our participants. Okay. So that last question was 94% are in favor. So let's turn the discussion over to Trevor Potter, our friend here at CED. Trevor, if you could start off with a couple of comments and set the stage here for us as to why this issue of gerrymandering and redistricting is so important to our health quality of our democracy.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to do that. America's promise is that in our democracy, every voice will be heard and every vote will be counted equally. Unfortunately, partisan politicians of both sides, when they've had the chance, using the power of government, have tried instead to ensure that their own political power has a lock on elections and seats. It's often said that allowing politicians to choose their voters rather than the other way around is a problem. It undermines citizen confidence in the integrity of our election system. What we see now is that partisan gerrymandering is worse than it has ever been. This is in large part the result of advances in computer technology, which enable the computer experts and the political consultants to target voters literally house by house and divide blocks to ensure that they have maximized the advantage of their party. This partisan redistricting process unfortunately makes the polarization that we see in Congress even worse, because it reduces the number of competitive elections. You end up with more safe Republican and Democratic seats where the candidates have to play to their primary electorate, their party base, rather than to the center. The overwhelming majority of Americans, about 71%, say they don't like this system and they would like the Supreme Court to place limits on lawmakers' ability to manipulate these voting maps. This includes 80% of Democrats and a supermajority, 68% of independents and 65% of Republicans, according to a bipartisan poll conducted last August. Some people say, well, why not rely on the politicians who are in charge of the state legislatures to fix the system? That's a little like putting the fox in charge of the hen house and then asking it to refrain from eating the chickens. It's not likely to happen. It's the temptation to secure an advantage for their party we have been seeing is just too tempting. That leaves it to the Supreme Court to set nationwide ground rules here that would apply both to the election of the U.S. House and the elections, drawing of lines for state legislatures. It happens that at this moment, there is both unprecedented momentum to rein in overly partisan redistricting and an unprecedented opportunity at the U.S. Supreme Court. The court currently has 3 separate cases pending before it that challenge partisan gerrymandering conducted by both Democrats and Republicans in slightly different ways. The court in the past has said that extreme partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional. But Justice Kennedy, who was the swing justice in that decision, said, we don't yet have an adequate test to determine what is excessively partisan. And until we have such a standard that we can ask lower courts to use, there's no way to judge this. So that's what is at stake here is, has the court now found a way, has it been presented with one or more ways to determine that something is in fact excessively partisan and therefore unconstitutional? As you may have seen, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court recently overturned that state's congressional district maps, saying that it was unconstitutionally partisan. They made that decision under the state constitution, and the Pennsylvania court ordered that more equitable maps be drawn immediately in time for the 2018 elections. That case has been appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we're waiting for final word. But I think we're hopeful that the Pennsylvania decision under its own constitution will stand. The Campaign Legal Center has filed a brief in that case. And the 2 other cases that are currently at the Supreme Court, 2 of the 3, in Wisconsin and North Carolina, bipartisan panels of judges, lower court judges in both cases, found that the gerrymandering that the state legislature had engaged in was so egregious that it violated the U.S. Constitution. In Wisconsin, partisan politicians met in secret behind locked doors with political consultants and computer experts in 2011 to produce a map which the litigation showed was specifically designed to manipulate state assembly lines to ensure one-party control for the next 10 years, irrespective of what it is the voters wanted to do. That is to say, they thought they had so successfully gerrymandered that even a swing to the other party would not change the legislature. So in the next election, the results were that the Republicans got 49% of the vote for the assembly and 61% of the assembly seats. We at the Campaign Legal Center, along with local partners in Wisconsin, sued the state using a measuring system that we argued in court enabled the judges to define the level of excessive partisan redistricting, and the court agreed, based on all the evidence in that case, including the test we suggested, that that was excessive. Paul Smith of the Campaign Legal Center, who will be talking with us shortly, argued that case in the court, and we are expecting a decision by the end of the year. That comes along with another case that is in the court from Maryland. And there it's the Democrats who operated behind closed doors and have conceded that their goal was to draw a map in a way that maximized the number of Democratic legislators and, quote, minimize the voice of the Republicans. The Democratic lawmakers were successful, moving around enough voters to ensure the Democrats now hold 7 of the 8 congressional districts in the state. Arguments in that case are scheduled at the end of March in the Supreme Court, and we filed an amicus brief. Finally, in North Carolina, the lawmakers who drew the congressional maps there were explicit that their maps were created to squeeze every ounce of partisan advantage for GOP candidates, for Republicans. Now, they were attempting to avoid a challenge under the Voting Rights Act that they were trying to hurt minorities. So they were very open about their partisan intent, saying, no, we weren't trying to hurt minorities. We were only trying to help Republicans. The great quote from the litigation is from Representative Lewis, who was the chairman of the House Redistricting Committee. He was asked in a deposition why he had drawn a map with 10 Republicans and 3 Democratic seats. His answer was because no matter how hard we worked, we could not figure out a way to make it 11 Republicans and 2 Democrats. In fact, that's exactly what happened. They got 10 of the 13 congressional districts in 2016. The lower court has determined that this was completely unconstitutional because of its excessive partisan purpose and effect. The Campaign Legal Center teamed up with other organizations to challenge these maps on behalf of the North Carolina League of Women's Voters. And the lower court decision in that case is now going to be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court issued a stay on the decision in the lower court pending argument in that case before the court. So with the cases that are currently before the court, Maryland, Wisconsin, North Carolina coming, an appeal from Pennsylvania, the court really has a chance to rein in the undemocratic small d practice of gerrymandering for purely partisan reasons, and to create some ground rules to ensure that the fundamental rights of all Americans to have their votes count is upheld. This is a real opportunity for the court to ensure that the norms of nonpartisanship and fairness are followed in redistricting nationwide, both for the House redistricting, which will be coming up in 2020, and state legislative redistrictings. We believe this is important, that a court decision saying that excessive partisanship is wrong and that there are standards that states must follow, it would be very helpful in improving the functioning of our democracy.
Create some sort of independent commission?
States have worked at that. Usually what happens is the independent commission is created by citizen initiative because the legislatures are rarely willing to give up that power themselves. And the problem there is that not every state has the ability to have an initiative. That tends to be something that more often the Western states with a progressive tradition have than the older Eastern states. So it's not possible in every state for the citizens to do that. Sometimes the legislatures will. North Carolina is talking about, Ohio is talking about doing that right now. There's been a push in Virginia to do it, but it tends to get wrapped around the axle of partisanship, each side trying to figure out what's in it for them. So it's hard to do that on a state-by-state level. I think it's arguable Congress could require such a thing, but they have shown at the moment no sign of wanting to do so. So if the court ruled the wrong way in Wisconsin and these other cases, that would in fact be the next alternative, but it's much slower and would not be a national result.
Right. So we're, as you know, we're talking largely to a business audience. We're talking to folks who represent companies, and this is a little different issue from what they are used to hearing. Why should the business community be concerned about the results of this case and this issue in general? Why should business care? And do you have examples of the business community becoming vocal advocates for reform?
Sure. First of all, I think in general, and I recognize that this is only the start of the conversation, but I think the business community benefits from public faith in our democratic system. When the public thinks the system is rigged and that their voices are being ignored, that's bad for the country, and I think that makes it bad for business. But on a more specific level, as I've explained, redistricting, gerrymandering occurs across the country depending on which party is in charge. So in the last couple of years, we've seen a real effort by the business community in Illinois to do something about the gerrymandering there, because it is a Democratic legislature that has gerrymandered to ensure that they remain in control of the legislature. The Republican governor there has opposed this. He has come up with ballot initiatives, which have then been struck down by the Democrat-dominated U.S. Illinois Supreme Court. And so they're stuck in partisan gridlock. They've been unable for a long time to adopt a budget. They haven't been able to do anything about changing their pension obligations and other fiscal issues that affect the health of the economic health of the state and therefore the business community. And yet you can't do anything about it because the vicious circle here is that the Democratic redistricting in that state has ensured the Democrats have control of the legislature. They can't therefore get the legislature to change and go to a nonpartisan system. So it depends on the state. In some states, Republicans at the moment have an advantage. I've spent a career in Republican politics before becoming more focused on reform issues. And what I say to my Republican friends is, you may be up now in some of these big states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, but who knows where you're going to be in 2020 after the next census and after the next election. And it may be that the Democrats, the wheel will turn, and the Democrats will take these same tools in these states to reverse both the legislative and the congressional gerrymandering and skew it way over the other way. So I don't think this is a partisan issue, first of all. Either party can get their ox gored depending on who wins the next election. And in terms of business, I think it's important for them that they are not suffering from the hyper-partisanship I think we have now at the federal level, partly as a result of these gerrymandered seats.
Right. And I think it's important to note, as I turn over to Paul Smith, but I think it's important to note that the majority of our participants today on the call, probably on election day when they vote for their representative, they probably are voting for an individual who's pretty much got that seat locked up, and that there's really very little competition in the system. And that's what we hope as advocates and as business leaders to combat a little bit, right?
That's correct. The estimates are that maybe a tenth of the House seats are seriously in play. So if you have, the current pollsters predict there would be a Democratic wave. If you had such a thing, that would be focused on 40, 50 seats as the battlegrounds out of a House of 435. And that does mean that a lot of those other elections are going to be decided in the party primaries, which much smaller turnout and not in the center. And it does mean that when people get to Congress, they therefore focus on their left-wing or right-wing base rather than worrying about how to bring in voters from both sides.
Perfect. So now I'm going to turn it over to Paul Smith, who's the Vice President for Litigation and Strategy at the Campaign Legal Center. Paul, welcome to the show. What's it like to argue a case before the Supreme Court?
It's an extraordinarily intense experience. You're only up there usually for about half an hour, but you might get 30 or 40 questions thrown at you in that period of time. The justices basically use the lawyers as punching bags to try to argue with each other. So it is something that requires a great deal of preparation for sure.
Well, my only experience, I attended a hearing one time, and I remember feeling like it was almost church-like. It was a very kind of reverent place, and the judges walked in and you all stood. It was a very quite a meaningful experience. But thank you for being with us today. And I know you've got some slides to share with us, so I'm not going to delay any further. Walk us through the case and the issue in general.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit primarily about the case of Gill versus Whitford, which is the Wisconsin gerrymandering case that Trevor mentioned. It's an attack on the assembly map in Wisconsin, 99 district assembly map. And this is the case that's pending in the Supreme Court and that I argued in October after we won in the trial court of a ruling that this is an unconstitutional gerrymander. We're hoping that we'll finally get something from the Supreme Court that allows courts to begin to put a meaningful remedy here. So far, while everybody's kind of understood that gerrymandering is unconstitutional, the courts haven't been able to articulate standards that allow them to play the role that I think they need to in pushing back on gerrymandering. Let me start off with just a little bit about our democratic principles. This is a quote from one of the framers, James Madison, emphasizing the point that not only should power be derived from the people, but that those entrusted with power should be kept in dependence on the people, which is a more fancy way of saying that the people should be able to throw the bums out if they decide that they made a mistake in giving power to one party or another in a legislature or in a congressional delegation or in any given district. And the whole point of a gerrymander is to prevent that from happening, to say we have decided in advance that for the next 10 years, we're going to control this legislature under almost any foreseeable electoral circumstance. And so what we see, in fact, as Trevor mentioned, is that gerrymandering, preventing people from throwing the bums out, deciding in advance who's going to be in control of that state, is a growing problem that is one that, if left unchecked, is going to continue to make our democracy less and less real. So a little bit of overview. What is partisan gerrymandering? We've been talking about it now for a few minutes, but maybe we should say what it is. It's using the district lines, legislative district lines, congressional district lines, to gain systematic advantage for one party over the other. And you do that, the traditional way is packing and cracking. And I'll explain what that means in just a minute. Packing and cracking the voters of your opposing party, the party you're trying to keep out of power. So what's packing and cracking? Well, let me use this illustration. This is a bit of a simplistic illustration of a jurisdiction, a state that has two parties, the teal party and the blue party. And the blue party has 30 of the 50 precincts where it has the majority, and the teal party has 20 of the 50 precincts where it has a majority. So it's kind of a 60-40 jurisdiction. But what this illustrates is that you can, even in a fairly one-sided state politically, end up with the teal party, the minority party, controlling 3 of the 5 districts. You can see how the lines are drawn here. They have 3 districts in which the teal party has a 6-4 advantage, and then there are 2 districts in which the blue party has a 9-1 advantage. So what's happening here in the 3 districts that are controlled by the teal party, a lot of those blue precincts are wasted. They're cracked. They're not able to control the district. And in the 2 districts that the blue party controls, they're ahead 9-1. So they have a lot of wasted voters there. They're packed into those 2 districts with a lot more voters than they need to maintain control. And that's how it is done. You either push all your opponent's voters into a few packed districts, or you spread the rest of them out so that they're basically powerless.
Paul,
yeah.
if I may, can I interrupt?
Sure.
So, and forgive, we have a little bit of a delay here, but I'm going to try to sneak in some questions along during your presentation. You know, Trevor talked eloquently about the fact that this is a nonpartisan or bipartisan issue. But the Wisconsin case is a case in which the Republicans exploited the system. So how, as advocates, when you're out there talking about this case, how do you bring it back home to the importance that this really is it's a case for our democracy and not just one party or the other?
Well, we tried very hard to make it clear to the court that this is a bipartisan problem and it needs a bipartisan solution. And one of the ways you do that in the Supreme Court is through amicus briefs, which is briefs filed by not the parties to the case, but by others who are interested in the case. And we worked very hard to get a great deal of support from a really impressive array of Republican leaders. Even though this is a pro-Republican gerrymander, we had support from Senator McCain, Governor Kasich, Governor Schwarzenegger, Lugar, Dole, a bunch of Republican members of the House as well. And so the message was, don't look at it in a very transitory way. The Republicans have more gerrymanders that they're benefiting from right now, but that may very well not be true in a couple of years. And it's bad for our whole democracy to have the kind of polarization that is resulting from these gerrymanders.
Okay, great.
let me give you a little bit on the law. The reason that the gerrymanders have not been held unconstitutional and prevented in the past is the court hasn't quite figured out what kind of standard to use. And they have this idea that they only want to attack the extreme ones. They don't want to rule out all consideration of politics in drawing these lines. And so that leaves them with the need to be able to separate the sheep from the goats, the really extreme gerrymanders that go way too far to taking power away from the people, versus the rather more normal politics as usual, where there might be a few districts that the party in power keeps for itself, but it doesn't really guarantee itself a lock for the whole 10 years until the next census. And what we've tried to do is resolve that problem by giving the court the tools to draw that line between extreme gerrymanders and just regular old politics. And we have a test that we propose in the Wisconsin case that the plaintiffs have to prove that they drew the lines with intent to favor one party, and that in fact the lines have a very large and durable effect of favoring one party, and that there's no reason that had to be done that way. There's sometimes are arguments made that it's a Republican gerrymander because the Democrats have moved into the cities or packed into certain neighborhoods, and therefore it's hard to have a fair map. And we leave it the option for the state to try to defend its map on that basis, although I think they'll seldom be able to do that. Those are the three steps of our test that we propose to the court.
So it sounds like to me, proving the extreme cases is going to be critical to the outcome of this ruling.
Absolutely. Because the court does not think it makes any sense, at least this is my assessment. Others may disagree, actually, and some of the other lawyers working in this area do disagree. But it doesn't make sense in our judgment to have a rule that says we're going to have state legislators drawing these districts, but we're going to require them to not think about politics at all, or at least pretend not to be thinking about politics at all, because they're political actors. What we want to do is have some check when they go way too far, they get greedy, as opposed to trying to say you have to completely sanitize the process. But that does leave you with the line drawing problem.
Right.
So let's a little bit about how we proved the case at the trial court in Wisconsin. The first thing we had to prove was partisan intent, and so we had a good story to tell about how this map was drawn. It was actually drawn in a locked conference room in a law firm outside the state capitol in Madison, where three consultants stayed in there for a period of 4 months. Almost no one else was allowed in the room. And what they did is try to figure out, with very careful software and mapping technology, how to maximize the advantage in the map in a way that would be durable, that even in a wave election, that Democrats would be unable to take control of the assembly in Wisconsin. And this is a graph that reflects the various maps they drew during that 4-month period. And they started off with the existing map down at the bottom left. And what they then did is they drew more and more biased maps, giving more and more seats to the Republicans, even at, with a vote of only 48-49%. They ratcheted up their seat level to more like 60-61%. And then they drew a bunch more maps. You see where the line levels off. That's where they're not trying to gain more seats, but they're trying to eliminate any competitive districts. Put every district on one side or the other, so that even in a wave election, there won't be very many, if any, that switch. The 59 or 60 or 61% of the seats that they drew for themselves, they'll be able to keep. So that story told a powerful story of intent. It's clearly what they were trying to do. It was their primary goal as they worked through the process of drawing a new legislative map for Wisconsin. And the court certainly understood, this is a quote from the decision of the trial court, what happened here, and that this was going to be a durable gerrymander, and that's what they set out to do. The second element, of course, is partisan effect. Did they actually draw a biased map, and how do you measure it? And this is where the technology, the mathematical formula comes in to try to help the court draw that line and identify the extreme gerrymanders, which Wisconsin one certainly is. And we came up with something called the efficiency gap, which is just a clever name for a little formula that helps you rate gerrymanders on their level of extremeness and identify the ones that are really the worst of the worst. And it's based on calculating the total number of wasted votes for each party in the map, and I'll explain what that means in just a minute. It's a fairly easy arithmetic formula, but it does allow you to assign a number to each gerrymander and compare the gerrymanders across time and across the country and rank them. What's important. And so we, using that technique, ranked the gerrymanders that have been drawn of state legislative districts all around the country going back to the 1970s. We looked at a data set of well over 200 different maps, and we're able to graph them and show that the Wisconsin map was one of the 5 worst in that whole data set. And all 5 of the most extreme gerrymanders in that 40-year period were drawn in 2011 after the last census. So things are clearly getting worse, and the Wisconsin map is an example of one of the worst of the worst.
So Paul,
yeah.
A question from the audience and is, sort of, well, elections have consequences? And if they do, isn't this what politicians should be doing? Is drawing a beneficial landscape for themselves and the fact that they've got elected? I mean, it is sort of what some people, I think out there, isn't it?
Well, I suppose that's true, and there were even Supreme Court justices have said similar things at times. But I would argue that what a gerrymander does is make the next election not have any consequences. Once you put in a gerrymander, then whatever there's swing in public sentiment there is with that map in place ends up not mattering. And we have an example of that right here in this slide. In 2012, with the new map in place, the Democrats got over 51% of the popular vote across the state for assembly, and got only 39% of the seats. And then 2 years later, they went down to 48%, and they lost a few more. They got 36%. And so this is a map, given the effects of incumbency and the bias in the lines, the Democrats would have to get something close to 60% of the statewide vote in order to have even a chance of getting 50% of the districts. And that's a figure that they've never achieved. This is a very purple state. Neither party ever gets anything like 60% of the vote statewide. And so it is effectively inconceivable that the Democrats can win back power, even if the public swings in their direction in a fairly powerful way. It
definitely seems unfair. But getting back to the efficiency gap, is that something the Supreme Court has used? Is that something that you guys are just using to try to argue your case?
Well, we're trying to answer they've not used it before. We're hoping they're going to adopt it. We're trying to answer the challenge that was laid down in that 2004 case, that Veith case, to give us a technique to draw the line. And so this is the technique we're offering to them, a technique that effectively says, let's look at all the wasted votes. Wasted votes are all of the votes you get for your party in districts you win above 50%. So in a 90-10 district, it's 40 wasted votes there. And all of the votes cast for your party in a losing district. So if you lost 60-40, there's another 40 wasted votes there. And in a gerrymander, what you see is a lot more wasted votes for one party than the other because they've been packed and cracked. And if you add those up and compare them and subtract one from the other and divide it by the total number of votes, you get a percentage, which is the number. So it's not a very complicated formula, but what it does is it looks directly at the packing and cracking and allows you to rank gerrymanders. And we're hoping that will give them the confidence that they can go ahead and feel that they can identify the extreme ones and not be trying to eradicate politics from the process altogether.
Perfect.
So we certainly satisfied the trial court. We had done that with the efficiency gap and with all the other evidence about how partisan this map was. And then the state tried to argue that the problem with Wisconsin is that Democrats only live in Milwaukee and Madison, and they packed themselves in there, and so you couldn't draw a fair map if you tried. And we responded to that by drawing a model map that satisfied all the state's legitimate criteria and was fair politically. There's a modest pro-Republican tilt in the way people are arrayed and have chosen to live in Wisconsin, but nothing nearly as extreme as the actual bias in the map that they drew. So we got ruling on that as well.
Good.
Now, the case then went to the Supreme Court, and that's where I came in because that's kind of my specialty. And we're trying to convince the court that this is actually a case where somebody could be allowed to win one of these claims. We had an extremely good factual record and findings by the district court that I've just told you about. And then we came in with a bunch of these amicus briefs, some of them talking about the social science, the efficiency gap, and the ability that social science now has to measure gerrymandering and separate out different kinds and different degrees. And then, as I mentioned before, we really tried to portray this as a bipartisan issue that people on both sides of the aisle understand needs to be fixed, because if we don't, we're just going to continue to be more polarized, and our politics is going to continue to be less effective and even more importantly, less responsive to the will of the people, which of course is the whole point. The other really central theme to our argument is it is getting so bad now that if you give it a pass and you say this practice is not going to be something the courts are going to do anything about, and people get completely confident that they can do this without any recompense, without any limit, with the technology we have now, in the next round of redistricting, Wisconsin's going to be a model for how to do it all over the country, and we're just going to have more and more of this. As Trevor mentioned, part of the reason it's getting worse is new technology and new access to data. But it's also because the American people have become more polarized themselves and are more predictable. People vote for the R or the D team, red or blue, much more frequently than they used to. The number of people who swing back and forth has gotten much smaller. And so it's easier to draw a gerrymander and be confident that it'll stick, how predictable people have become. So those are the themes that we tried to hit in the Supreme Court. The argument seemed to go really well. I got the predictable hostility from some of the people that we knew we were unlikely to get the vote from: the Chief Justice, Justice Alito, Justice Gorsuch. The Chief Justice referred to the efficiency gap as sociological gobbledygook, said it was too complicated. Some of the other justices, though, seemed to think it was pretty easy arithmetic. And the interesting thing is that I got no questions at all from the justice who seems most likely to decide the case, which is Justice Anthony Kennedy, the perennial swing justice, the one who laid down the challenge back in 2004 to give them a formula to draw the lines, to draw a line between extreme and less extreme gerrymanders. And he seemed, at least as far as one can tell in these things, not unhappy with what we'd offered up to him. At least he didn't say anything that suggested he had a problem with our proposed test. So we're hopeful that we will find out and get a good ruling. On the timing, we had wanted to get the decision earlier than usual, maybe even as early as this month. But then what happened is the court in December took a second case. The Maryland congressional case that Trevor mentioned is now being briefed and will be argued at the end of March. And so our supposition is that likely means we won't hear about the Wisconsin case until they're ready to decide the Maryland case as well. And that likely means we'll be hearing, as one usually does on big cases in the Supreme Court, hearing a ruling come down in June of 2018. Which will make it in question whether or not any remedy can be put in place if we win any of these cases for the 2018 elections. It's conceivable that we'll have to use the old maps for 2018 and get a remedy put in place for 2020. The court does not really kind of frowns a little bit on making big changes in the electoral system right before an election. So we'll have to see how that all plays out.
Yeah. So Paul,
so that's kind of the end of the slides. I can certainly talk some more about the case or the problem in general. I also could talk a little about the Maryland case if you'd like, Mike.
Well, I was just going to ask, do you think Justice Roberts, when he writes his opinion, will include the term gobbledygook?
It's possible. Although he got a rather funny letter from the president of the American Sociological Association saying we're shocked and appalled that you don't think that sociology is a useful technique for solving many problems and studying the way the country works. And here's a lot of these problems we've solved. We'd be happy to come give you a tutorial, you and your clerks, about the value of sociological data and analysis. I don't think that the Chief Justice likely took them up on it, but so he may not want to repeat the use of that particular phrase. The other thing that he talked a lot about in the argument, the Chief Justice was concerned that if they start deciding these cases, they're going to seem very political, because in every case they're either going to have to rule for the Republicans or the Democrats, and people are going to interpret their rulings as basically favoring one party or the other. That may well be why they took this second case out of Maryland, the case challenging the Democratic gerrymander of the congressional districts in Maryland, because they sort of liked the idea that they could look at a case done by each party and rule simultaneously.
Is the Maryland case as egregious as Wisconsin?
Well, it's a much smaller set of districts, and it is a pretty one-sided blue state, Maryland. But 7-1 is a gerrymander. The efficiency gap's very high there. The right number is probably more like 5-3 or 6-2 to reflect the politics of that state. Interestingly, the case is not actually about the whole statewide map. They're focusing on one district in Western Maryland that was redrawn in 2011 by the Democrats to transform it from a red district to a blue district. And their claim is that change of that one district is inherently unconstitutional, because it's a form of retaliation against the voters of that district for making the wrong political choices in prior elections. And so that's quite a different theory from the one that I was laying out for you here, which clearly we had a very statewide focus in our case. And they view the matter differently than we do. And we'll have to see how the court looks at those two very different theories.
Right. So you mentioned the amicus briefs. Were there any kind of surprise briefs that you felt, I don't know about surprise, but maybe that you felt really helped bolster the case?
Well, we had a number of briefs from people who have expertise in the area of political science and analysis, who were able to confirm to the court that things have gotten worse continuously in this, and that the danger going forward is that it's going to continue to get even more worse. And one of the things they talked about is the kind of data analytics that have been developed even in the years since the last round of redistricting in 2011 that are going to be available in 2021 after the next census. The whole prospect is quite frightening. And so that was, I think, something we tried to do. But the other thing that was really important is to have so many respected members of politicians and former politicians come in and show that they think our politics is broken in significant part because of the way these districts are drawn. And so this was an effort to convince the court that it is the only institution that can help fix politics. But the politicians, at least many of them, want it to be fixed. They see this as something that, while they're not able to fix it themselves, that would make the world better. One of the people who led this effort for us and recruited a lot of the other Republicans was Governor Schwarzenegger, former governor of California, who speaks very powerfully about the way it was in California when he was elected governor, and they had a gerrymandered legislature, and everybody knew that it didn't matter what they did, they were going to get reelected. It's either a red district or a blue district, and they didn't try hard and they didn't govern effectively. And what they did in California was use a referendum to pass an independent commission, and that has changed the responsiveness of the elected officials there to the voters in a way that Governor Schwarzenegger talks about very interestingly and eloquently.
Right. And
so, I think those were our two main things. Of course, there were briefs arrayed against us, and some of them in this case, because it was a Republican gerrymander, came from the RNC and people like that. And I think that's unfortunate in a way, because as we said before, whatever advantage one party happens to have in this area right now is they may very well be, the tables may be turned very, very quickly, given the politics and how things are evolving in this country.
And Trevor, I don't know if you're still there, but I'm sure having these prominent Republicans like Senator McCain and Governor Kasich and Governor Schwarzenegger, makes your argument for why this is a bipartisan issue a lot stronger.
It does. I think support from those people, the very strong brief that they entered, is important there. It's important for the court to understand that this is not a way for Democrats to get more seats, but rather that senior respected leaders of both parties think this is important for the future of the country, for the future of the system. And I think Paul did a great job in the Supreme Court of saying to them, if you don't do something, this is going to get a lot worse. The pace of technology here is going to be stronger, and the norm has, for the moment, been changed. It used to be that people tried to protect their incumbents. Now they are really leaning into what Paul has described as trying to seize control for the future, even if the electorate doesn't want them to. I think that's substantively different.
Right. And Trevor, you alluded to this early in your presentation, but for those participants, audience members today who are listening in and who are still scratching their head trying to think about the business case here, remember that in a lot of these states, there's nothing getting done. I mean, bills and progress, it's just not happening. And for businesses and companies, they need that kind of predictability. They need to know what's going to come out of their legislatures to plan for themselves. And if there's just a logjam because the system is rigged politically, that really does have an impact on our economy and has an impact on business, correct?
I think that's entirely correct. The gridlock we get is a problem across the country. The other thing is, again, just to remember that businesses, as you say, want predictability. They don't think that it's a good idea to go to Las Vegas and throw the dice for the future of their economic system. And that's what happens when you say, we are going to wait and see every 10 years which party wins the election after the census, and we're going to let them totally rewrite the map and the rules for the next 10 years. With that combined with computers gives you a potential for a wild swing in these states from one party to the other. So in states that currently Republicans hold and have gerrymandered it, you could see it go the other way at the state and the federal level for a decade then of serious effects on business. That's why I think our system of having elections every 2 years for Congress, usually every 4 years for a state legislature, is a solid one, and trying to short circuit it and say, no, we're going to put everything on the roulette wheel on the 10-year redistricting is ill-advised and a problem for business.
So we're closing down in our hour here, and I just wanted to go back to Paul and see if there was anything he wanted to add before we close out.
Oh, yeah. Let me just say, if it turns out that the Supreme Court just decides it doesn't want to provide a remedy for this problem at the federal level, there are two other things that are going to start to happen. People are going to be up in arms about this. People are very upset about gerrymandering in this country. And there's the two things they're going to do is they're going to do what Trevor said, try to get ballot measures passed and try to persuade where they can their fellow voters to pass these ballot measures, or sometimes they may have to pass through the legislature to get there. But there's going to be a real popular uprising on this. The other thing is people can still sue in state court, as they did in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania congressional decision is based on state law, and whatever the U.S. Supreme Court says doesn't preclude state Supreme Courts from starting to try to police this. I think you'll see some of that as well. The fight will not be over, but this could be. On the other hand, this is the time when we really hope we get a national solution at the federal level.
Well, I want to thank Trevor Potter and Paul Smith for being our guests today. Thank you so much for being here and talking about this important issue. And Paul, I wouldn't take the gobbledygook comment all too seriously. You obviously did a terrific job in your arguments, and we wish you luck in your decision. The Committee for Economic Development, made up of business leaders, that we're concerned about this issue as well. And we have a policy brief that will be released in the coming weeks that's going to address this strictly through a business lens and the importance of why business leaders need to care about redistricting practices and gerrymandering and how that has an impact, as I mentioned earlier, on the overall economy. So I think we've had a very fruitful discussion today. I want to again thank our guests. I want to remind our audience that our next webcast will be May 3rd at 11 a.m. Topic to be determined. We have a couple of policy issues that are growing rapidly as we speak, and what we'd like to do is keep these timely for folks. So sometimes we don't want to plan them out too far in advance, as the political cycle here in Washington has a funny way of changing on a daily basis. I want to thank everyone again for participating, and I'm going to sign off now. My name is Michael Petro from the Committee for Economic Development of the Conference Board, and thanks so much for being with us today.